All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good night. I don't know where you're all joining us. We have people joining us from a bit everywhere, which is always super exciting. Before we start, just a few words on what the Rimon Movement is. So, the Rimon Movement is an international student led movement that was created 6 months ago to reimagine Israel education on campus. We do that through many different initiatives that you can find on our website, rimonmovement.com. And one of the initiatives that we do is webinars. And today we're very, very excited. We're going to have an awesome webinar. Just a few reminders to ask questions. You should see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A option. If you're watching us on Facebook, please feel free to ask your question in the comment, and we'll make sure to ask it at the end of the presentation. Tonight, we are joined by Ateret, who is an incredible person with an incredible life story, has lived in a bunch of different places, and does a lot of incredible work. And I won't give too much of an introduction because she'll tell you everything about her. And hopefully later during the webinar, we'll be joined by the co-founder of the organization that she started, and they'll have a discussion together. But in the meantime, we're very excited to have Ateret. And Ateret, thank you so much for joining us. And the stage is all yours.
See. I can't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can't turn on my video. I think you need to make me a host again.
Okay. Here you go.
There we go. Fabulous. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Ateret Violet Shmuel. I am an activist and an artist and an educator from many different places, mostly the East Coast of the United States and Jerusalem, Israel. I'm currently in Las Vegas, Nevada, on the land and territory of the Paiute Nation as a guest. I have spent the majority of my life as an activist and a human rights and Indigenous rights advocate in one capacity or another. I've been involved with many, many, many different NGOs and movements, both in the United States and the Middle East. And I want to, before I even begin talking, I want to apologize if I'm like a little scattered. It's been a while since I actually spoke. I've spent most of the last Corona year coordinating emergency relief through our organization. So feel free to ask any questions. I love questions. So basically, I'm many things, but I'm also the director, the US director of Indigenous Bridges. I am Jewish, but because of my work with tribal nations, I've been adopted by several tribal nations as well. And we do a lot of things with Indigenous Bridges. But Indigenous Bridges as a whole is an international Indigenous solidarity network, essentially. But our main focus has been, for the last 3.5 years, to create connections between Jews and other Indigenous tribal nations throughout the world. And for the last 3.5 years or so, our main focus has been on creating connections between Jews and Native Americans and First Nations people, the Indigenous people of North America mainly. Although we do work with tribal nations all over the Pacific Islands, the Middle East. We work a lot of other Middle Eastern Indigenous peoples. And soon we will be expanding even more. So Indigenous actually wonderfully has become a term that's come up a lot recently. It's used a lot in activism and academia, in the media, but very few people actually really know what it means. Like, what is it to be Indigenous? And there are many different working definitions, but as an organization and as an activist, I like really appreciate the definition sort of put out by Jose Martinez Cobo. And we use sort of like an abridged definition for our organization. And so according to that definition and a lot of the more used, like commonly acceptable definitions of Indigenous, an Indigenous people are a people or a nation that has its ethnogenesis from within a specific land space, who have a continued connection to that land space that predates colonial contact. And there are several different boxes that you have to tick off. In addition to that, you have to have a unique language, culture, dress, tradition, religious or spiritual framework that's connected to that people in that land space and unique to them. And in addition to that, the desire to transmit those things to future generations. So according to that definition specifically, which is has been added onto, but that's one of the most commonly used definitions. There are people who are Indigenous and there are people who are not necessarily. But if you think about Jews, if you understand Jewish identity, we fit that definition completely. We are a nation that had our ethnogenesis from within the land of Israel, who have had a continued connection to that land space that predates colonial contact. We have a unique language, languages, culture, dress, religious framework, and spiritual tradition, and the desire to pass that on to our future generations. That definition and many definitions have actually been added on to by bodies like the UN in a way that specifically is intended to exclude Jews from that definition. But I'll touch more on that in a little bit. So as an Indigenous people, there's an understanding that Indigenous peoples have a unique relationship to our land, and are sort of seen as like the spiritual stewards of that land, as Indigenous peoples around the world are. And Judaism, if you look into Judaism as a religion, there are many pieces of our scripture, our culture, that have to do with our Indigenous land of Israel. Our religion is all centered around the change of seasons, the growth of food and harvests in the land of Israel, and all things of that nature. When we pray facing towards Jerusalem if we're in diaspora. The very nature of the concept of diaspora, a diaspora is like a person in diaspora is an Indigenous person who has been removed from their Indigenous land, so who is living on land outside of their own. So Jews have a very sort of interesting and unique position in the world as diasporic Indigenous people, because we have managed to maintain our culture and our tradition and our language and our spirituality and our names and our dress, even outside of our traditional Indigenous lands. And within that framework, we can understand that Zionism, what is Zionism? There are many different ideas about like what Zionism is. And of course, there are many different kinds of Zionism, but ultimately from an Indigenous framework, Zionism is an Indigenous rights movement, which has succeeded in regaining sovereignty. A native people regained sovereignty and ownership and autonomy in our traditional land, and essentially pulled our people back from all the corners of the earth, and revitalized our ancient language and traditions and agricultural traditions within our traditional land space. There's a lot of resistance to that by major colonialist forces. So there's been a lot of anti-Zionist propaganda that's been sort of funneled into many different facets of many different societies. And it's in essence, it's this, there's a lot of conversations about like what anti-Zionism is and what anti-Semitism is, right? And essentially, let's just define anti-Semitism for a while, for a moment before moving forward, which is anti-Semitism is sort of this like amorphous thing. And so it's hard to sort of like pin down a little bit, right? But it ultimately is the portrayal of Jews as whatever a particular community finds especially vile at any given moment in history and time. And so we have it on all ends of all political spectrums throughout history, throughout cultures, throughout the world. But if we're working within the framework of like Western political systems, essentially you have right versus left-wing anti-Semitism. So let's pull that apart a little bit. Right-wing anti-Semitism is pretty easy to sort of point out at this point. It's the portrayal of Jews as brown, foreign, Middle Eastern, rabble-rousing, socialist globalists who will stop at nothing to overthrow the established order and give over power to the people who can't, who shouldn't be trusted with power. And so they have to be, Jews have to be stopped in order for civilization, in order to continue to exist. And that often, like if we look at extreme versions of right-wing anti-Semitism, that's often Nazism, fascism. But anti-Semitism on the left is a little bit more sneaky. And that's the kind that I come into contact all the time as a human rights advocate, as a Indigenous rights advocate, as an academic, and as somebody who's worked in social justice and human rights for like 20 something years now. This is what I come into contact with all the time, is this this portrayal of Jews as white, as European, as specifically white European colonialist settlers who uphold white supremacy and systemic racism, who think that we're better than everybody else and profit off the backs of other marginalized minority groups, who are the established order, the fat cat money grubbing, like media moguls, and who have illegally stolen indigenous Palestinian land and are now committing human rights atrocities and genocide and apartheid in the Middle East. And so we must be taken care of so that there can be justice. Now that has become increasingly present throughout my world, at least in academia, in the media, in political figures on the left. The fame of certain celebrities using their platforms to spout this. It was present, unfortunately, in places like the Women's March and Black Lives Matter with Linda Sarsour and other politicians like that. But it is just as right-wing anti-Semitism, it is left-wing anti-Semitism, and it's not based on the reality and truth of really what Jews are and who we are and what we do and our experience in life. But it has been used as a tool to invalidate any of our experiences of oppression also, by sort of painting us as the bad guys. And now that narrative has been intentionally funneled into activist communities for the last 15, 20 years. And as a tiny tribal indigenous minority, we as Jews tend to know a lot about ourselves and our own drama. And we assume that other people understand that and know anything about us. But in reality, in my experience, people just don't. People don't have any clue whatsoever what it means to be a Jew, who Jews are, what we look like. There's this idea that we all look the same, and that's obviously not the case. That we're European, which is not the case. And so it's been a really interesting thing to try and figure out how to effectively combat. And so that's one thing. Tribal nations around the world, on the whole, indigenous tribal people have a very, we share a history for the most part. We have been minority, we're a minority group. We have almost across the board experienced colonization, genocide, cultural and physical genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced assimilation, removal from our lands, and have been systemically oppressed by major colonialist forces. And that's not just, that's like all over the world. And Jews have experienced that pretty much everywhere we go, right? You have, but also in our lands in Israel. And the erasure of our culture is part of that. But it's not, that experience isn't unique to us. We have experienced that, and so have the majority of other tribal nations. And what happens to a tribal nation, or any minority community really that's like tightly knit after they experience a massive trauma, is that they tend to sort of like circle inward, face, go inside of our community, sort of close off, and try to heal. We lose trust and faith in people outside of our communities, and because of what happened to us, and which is understandable, and we don't often really venture so far outside of our communities, and because of that, in general, people outside of our communities don't really know anything about us. And so there really has not been, being that that's the case for tribal nations around the world, there really hasn't been a lot of overlap between Jews and Native Americans, for example, because all of us have experienced that. And so all of us have sort of pulled inward, and have focused on our own issues and trying to protect ourselves as best we can against oppressive and bigoted forces. So what we've been trying to do is to create bridges between our communities, because we have so much to benefit from partnerships, from learning about each other, from becoming advocates on each other's behalf, from creating mutually beneficial relationships. And also our communities have been pitted against each other. Many of you, I understand, are students. And there is a well-funded smear campaign about Israel and Jews and Zionists that has penetrated most human rights, most social justice, most indigenous rights communities. And so there's a lot of misinformation that exists within those communities. And the only way to really counter that is by creating relationships. So what we do as an organization, we have a team, we have a core team, Indigenous Bridges, of many different leaders from different tribal nations around North America, from the Cree to Cherokee, Navajo, Oglala Lakota Sioux. One of our board members is Métis, and we sort of we create ambassadors between our communities, and educational initiatives, get to cultural exchange programs. I'll lay out essentially what Indigenous Bridges does in a minute, but we found that the only way forward is by getting to know one another, by creating these cultural exchange and real relationships with one another, so that we can not only dispel the myths that are being spread about us in other communities, but also to work together for our common goals, because we're stronger together as minority populations. We are, and we have what to give. We have resources, we have currency, we have voices, we have interesting roles in society, and Jews specifically and Native Americans are sort of uniquely positioned to help each other. In the United States alone, there are there's almost 600 federally recognized tribal nations. Each are unique. You have some groups that are very similar, that come from like a similar family originally, and speak similar languages and have similar cultural practices. But for the most part, every single tribe is unique and has unique culture, unique language, unique stories, traditions, ways that they define themselves. Like Jews and sort of our halacha, each tribe has their own set of rules and systems and laws and definitions about who belongs to them and who doesn't. And there's also, so in countries like the US, specifically in the US, you have different statuses of different people. You have Native Americans who have federal recognition, tribes who have federal recognition and therefore get federal benefits sometimes. You have tribes who have state recognition and get less benefits. And tribes who are unrecognized, who have a tribal history, who are native, but are not recognized by the United States. And so I work with many people from many different tribes with many different recognition statuses. But the whole concept of recognized versus non-recognized is an act of cultural genocide against those tribal nations themselves by the United States government. So each one of them has a different story, a different keta, like a different history. But in general, across the board, the end goal of Indigenous people is dignity and sovereignty and autonomy in their own land, the right to be who they are and speak their language and practice their traditions in freedom. Most people don't really know much about the sort of painful history of colonization in the United States, but there was a incredibly brutal systemic genocide that took place, and it continues to take place in this country against its Native people. It was until the 1990s that Native children were forcibly removed from their homes by the government and put with white families or families that were deemed better, and residential schools. They were called Indian schools or residential schools, where they were forbidden from speaking their language. In many cases, contacting their family. They were given different names. Their hair was cut, which is like a horrific thing for many people. They weren't allowed to leave. They weren't allowed to practice their traditions, and their heritage, their culture, their traditions were brutally cut out from underneath them. And so there's a lot of trauma there. And there's almost no knowledge of this outside of their communities. And that's one of the ways that enforces people feeling sort of like isolated and misunderstood by other people, is a lack of understanding of our context, of our culture, of our history, of what we've experienced, of our trauma. And, Jews also have a pretty traumatic history. And so we have a lot to gain together by partnering with communities to heal, to share our wisdoms, to move together, to work together, to move forward towards common goals, and help each other regain sovereignty, to help each other create systems of economy, of commerce, of education that are no longer oppressive and that aren't based on bigotry or genocide. So it's really important for us to learn, to really take it upon ourselves to find communities near us and get to know them. Because we have so much in common. We have so much in common. So the organization that I work for, Indigenous Bridges, is a non-partisan nonprofit. Our board and our team completely spans the spectrum, politically, religiously, economically, ethnically, but we're united in our belief that Indigenous people have a unique relationship to our lands and deserve access to those lands and self-determination. And so we have sort of four main goals in our project. One is political solidarity. So learning about each other, figuring out what the issues are, and figuring out how to show up for each other in concrete ways, to use our voices, our communities, to push for justice, and to stand up for each other, to be partners in creating a more just world. So we do that in a multitude of ways, but mainly by creating these community partnership programs and educational material and events where people really get to know one another. And then we use our voices in policy change, in academia. We introduce Indigenous history into schools. We push petitions through. We're putting together a legal team to advocate for the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is another huge issue. And the injustice that a lot of Native people face. And also to combat the hate speech, the anti-Indigenous hate speech, anti-Semitism included, that our communities are dealing with. The second piece of what we do is agricultural. So Indigenous peoples have a unique relationship to our land, as I spoke about a little bit before. And many of us have been forcibly removed from our lands. And so we've lost our traditions, or our traditions aren't necessarily applicable. And so one of the things we're trying to do is create this network where all Indigenous people can share their traditional agricultural wisdom and new technological innovations in order to help all of us sort of reconnect to our land space in a productive and sustainable way, which removes a lot of the oppressive parts of our lives from our communities. Indigenous people in general have a higher instance of things like heart disease, diabetes, and other food-related illnesses because of the systemic removal of those people from their traditional food sources, and the intentional funneling into those communities of things like sugar, which didn't exist before, and alcohol and all sorts of other things. So by creating a reconnection to our land, we are really able to stave off some really intense symptoms of genocide. And so one of the things that we do is we're currently bringing Israeli agricultural technology to Native American reservations, and showing up like that for people who really need it and for whom nobody else has showed up is a very fundamental piece of relationship building. So that's really important. And a lot of communities are lacking really basic things like food and water. For example, Navajo Nation, with whom I work very closely, 30 to 35% of Navajo Nation has literally no drinking water. So one of the projects that we've been working on for about 2 years now is bringing Israeli water technology out to Navajo Nation as a pilot project, and then we hope to expand from there. But that's there's a lot more to that. Just breezing through. The third piece of what we do is economic. So a lot of communities in the United States specifically have been systemically impoverished. They're not able to make a living off of their own resources in their own communities. A lot of them have been forced onto very small reservations and then not allowed to create economic systems. They're not allowed to build businesses. They're not allowed to use their natural resources. They're not allowed to sell things. And so there's incredible poverty on a lot of reses. And we as a people, Jews are known for our ingenuity and our ability to make something, to create tech, to find the loopholes and things. And so we're creating a whole bunch of systems in partnership with the nations that we work with, and coming from the nations that we work with. We're not going in as an external organization or people and telling people that like this is what you should do, but we are supporting Native-run, Native-owned businesses and projects as partners, because we believe that that's the right thing to do. And creating entire means of economic sufficiency from a place of dignity and honor in our own words, in our own languages, and our own lands from our own hands. And in doing so, also encouraging the transmission of culture. We do a lot of arts and agriculture and tourism. And it's beginning to really take root and be a huge source of blessings for all of the people that are involved. And the last piece of what we do, the fourth piece of what we do, is cultural exchange programs. So and events. We bring communities together to get to know each other. We hosted an incredible project in Boston about a year and a half ago, Sukkot. We had the local tribal leaders come out and be hosted in the sukkah, which just so happened to be on Indigenous Peoples Day. And we taught the local Jewish community about the cultural taboos and the importance of showing up and learning and listening. And there was incredible relationships have been built for the last few years. And from those relationships, many different projects are blooming and blossoming. And it's like an incredible blessing to be a part of this. How long have I been talking? The truth is that Indigenous nations around the world, Indigenous peoples as a whole, are the fates of our people are interconnected and interdependent. And we have so much to gain from working together, from learning about each other, from partnering, that it's really the only way forward. So I want to open this up a little bit to questions, and I want to see if Laura showed up, one of my partners from the project. I don't know if she did. And I wanted to see if I could answer some questions. Unless you want me to talk more, in which case I'm happy to do that. I can talk for forever about whatever.
Yeah, no, I checked. Laura is not here at the moment, so we'll just get started with the question. Thank you so much already. This has been fascinating. We've already received a lot of messages saying that this is awesome, and we have many questions. So
I'm also happy. I'm so sorry. I'm also happy at a later point to come back on with some more of my teammates. I have several of my like partners are both Native and Jewish.
All right.
And so bringing that perspective in is something that we could do. We couldn't arrange it in such a short amount of time, but we can do it if there's an interest.
All right, yeah, we'll definitely talk about that then. But the first question is, I believe this was from Pearl, who asked, what do you make of the part of Martinez-Cobo report that states that a group must be non-dominant?
Right. So we don't hold by that. Yeah, that part of it is with the intent to keep Indigenous populations marginalized, and obviously doesn't come from the self-definition of any Indigenous peoples. You know, you take people who have worked their whole lives for sovereignty and regain it at some point, and then what, they're not Indigenous anymore? No, that's not how that works. So it's a very problematic clause, and there are many problematic clauses in the definition of Indigenous from all around the spectrum, and not just COBO's, but everybody's. But yeah, as an organization, we think that's not. I'm not going to swear, but we don't hold by that.
All right. The next question here is, what is the most inspiring thing that you have experienced throughout your work?
Oh man. I have had the incredible honor of seeing so many inspiring and impactful things happen. So I've been involved in Indigenous rights advocacy for about 20 years now in some capacity or another. You know, like mostly my work has been in the background. I don't being sort of like in the forefront is kind of a new thing for me. Especially as an activist who has children and is a woman, I get a lot more hate than say like a male counterpart who doesn't. And it's scarier for me because I have people to protect, but I've had in the last couple of years an incredible amount of like these beautiful, powerful experiences with other tribal nations. What's the most impactful? Let's see. I was adopted. I've been given, like me personally, I've been taken in by several tribal nations and considered like their own, which is about as powerful an experience as one can get. Because you know, if you're family, you know, and so like there are many. I have gained new family members now. I've also seen people show up for each other in incredible ways. Oh, you know what? This is an easy question. Just kidding. It's absolutely not. But I think the most powerful thing that happens, like nekuda, like point blank, is when COVID hit. When COVID hit, we had this existing network of tribal nations who had been getting to know each other, and in the United States, at least, the two populations that were sort of hit the hardest by COVID-19 were Jews and Native Americans, in part because of the nature of tribal identity, because our lives sort of center on community, on ceremony. We often live really close to each other, like on top of each other with multiple generations in the same home. And there's a very real dependence on community, on family, on tribe. And so when this virus started ripping through this country, it hit us harder than almost anybody else. But whereas Jews managed to sort of like kind of be okay, a lot of the Native nations that I work with had no resources, because even at the best of times, like before COVID, there wasn't clean or running water, or access to medicine is like hilariously pathetic at best, and fatal at worst, which is generally. And there just like wasn't, you just had people that were like at an incredible disadvantage, and they were asking for help from the systems that were supposed to be helping them, and nobody was showing up. Nobody was coming through. The federal aid packages didn't come in until months and months and months later. And so I work really closely with Navajo Nation. Actually, this is most all of my jewelry was given to me by different tribal nations. I tend to like wrap myself in tribal love and solidarity whenever I talk. And this was given to me by a woman named Tanya Benali from Navajo Nation when I went out there a couple of years ago. But Navajo Nation was hit really, 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 really hard, and people were dying a lot. I think they had, I don't remember the statistic off the top of my head, so I'm not going to make it up, but they had way above the average for the state and nation of cases and fatalities, and nobody was showing up for them. So we mobilized and fundraised, and I managed to get about $45,000 worth of $40,000 probably worth of emergency medical equipment out to Navajo Nation. They got hit in the end of March. We got it out the beginning of April. And since then, I have been sending out Corona relief, mostly sourced from Jewish donations from Jewish communities around the country, to nations that were hit the hardest. So we've sent out to the Oglala Lakota Sioux up in Pine Ridge, which is one of the most systemically impoverished reses there is. I don't know if you guys heard about Standing Rock, but it's also the Oglala Lakota Sioux. We work very closely with them. In fact, one of our board members is Oglala. And we just sent them out water because they don't have any water. And we've been sending out PPE, we've been sending out hand sanitizer. We've partnered with like this nursing organization and sent out like actual medical personnel. Water, food, just all of the basic things that people needed to protect themselves against this virus that weren't there. We managed to really resource and send out quicker than anybody else could. And thank God we really, I mean, we can never really know, but it seems pretty clear that we managed to save a lot of lives that way. And I'm really grateful that we were in that position, because it could have been really, really bad. So I am currently sending out aid to about 40 different nations still to this day, based entirely on donations, and mainly from the Jewish community. So that's been profoundly powerful and has made a huge impact in so many lives, and is the kind of thing that we need these networks to do, because without them, people die. So thank God. Hope that answers that.
The work that you do is truly amazing. Like, I see all your posts on Facebook, and the people that you reach, the people you help, and we'll talk after the webinar, but Rimon definitely wants to be involved in some way in helping you with this. So watching the webinar and wants to help, stay tuned. We'll definitely do something.
You can also put the link for donations.
Oh yeah. I'll put the link in the chat, the link for the donation. The next question that we actually got the same question pretty much at the same time from two students, one from Canada and one from the US. The question is basically, the first part, I guess, is, have you lost allies or partners because of Israel-Palestine? And then the second part of the question, I guess, is how do you make connections with other progressive people, organizations, when people are so hostile towards Jews and Israel?
So
yeah, it's not an easy question.
That's a great question. So the truth is that my background, my academic background, let me go back a little bit. I have worked in Indigenous rights, and that's been a focus of my activism and advocacy for about 20 years. But my actual main area of expertise, my academic background and my activism background has tended to be historically based around the Arab-Israeli conflict. I actually used to be a BBC commentator, or punching bag, if you, it's basically the same thing, on this subject. So I have lost, in my own personal life, when I started actually finding the courage to like speak up and counter some of like the crazy stuff that I was seeing in my own circles, I've been kicked out of organizations. I've been blocked from Facebook groups. I've lost friends because, and it's mostly people that don't actually know anything about the conflict at all, who have like a very strong emotional attachment to their misinformed opinion and no space to actually listen to someone who knows what's going on. And my activism hasn't, like, I worked in human rights. I've worked in human rights in the Palestinian territories. I, you know, have been very involved in issues, in human rights issues with Palestinians and Arabs and the Arab-Israeli conflict from many different angles and many different sides. But in my experience, people want that conflict to be simple. They want there to be a good guy and a bad guy. And they don't want to do the work to learn about it and understand the nuanced issues and the history and who the actual people are. So you have this commonly accepted view, which is now like all over the place, that Palestinians are indigenous, when in fact they're not. Like, they're Arab, and Arabs are one of the main imperialist, like, colonist settlers of the world right now. We see that in language and in the colonization of the Middle East and North Africa. And 50% of people who are now identified by the UN as Palestinians showed up to that region during the Balfour Declarations, like 100 years ago. So does that mean that they're not deserving of rights and dignities and access to basic necessities? Absolutely, it does not mean that. It means that, wait, what did I say? That they are deserving. That's what I mean. They are deserving of those things, but does it make them indigenous? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Are white people from Europe indigenous to the Americas? No, they're colonialist settlers. Should they have access to rights and dignities? Of course. You know, there's been this uptick in the use of indigenous as a buzzword, and that's very true in Canada, where indigenous issues are spoken about a lot more than they are in the United States. In the United States, there's basically this giant erasure of indigenous people as a whole, and just pretend that they don't exist. And so there is a very well-funded campaign from this sort of pan-Arab colonialist entity that has media outlets like Al Jazeera, the Qatari state propaganda mill, that put out this misinformation. I mean, Al Jazeera actually is really responsible for a lot of that crazy propaganda, and has successfully rebranded. I don't know if you guys know this, successfully rebranded to American leftists as AJ+. That's Al Jazeera, and sort of shows up for indigenous people in certain ways. They showed up at Standing Rock. They showed up to Black Lives Matter. They showed up to many different like human rights and indigenous rights movements and projects, and demonstrations and tried to create and have created this this sort of recognition, this sort of like, we see you, we understand what you're going through. We're also going through that at the hands of those evil Jews. And so that narrative has been spread very successfully. And there's been very little in the way to counter it. And so as someone with a background in the history of the Middle East, from a reputable university, and 20 years of hands-on activism and advocacy work, and policy work, I started speaking up about this and countering it in my own circles and activist circles. And I've definitely lost allies. People are very, very married to their ideas of what's happening. And there's a real emotional charge with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you don't find with a lot of other conflicts that people aren't involved in. You know, you have people that have like never left, I don't know, Ohio, who are convinced that they're an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and don't want to hear from anybody who's ever been in the region, because they don't want it to like counter what they believe. And so that's really complicated. But in general, and sort of like to counter that a little bit, I do believe that in most cases, people just don't know. People just don't actually have the information. And I have found that in many cases, people are interested and are open to hearing another perspective if it's given over in a way that they can receive it. So unfortunately, in my world, I see a lot of people like wanting to like win arguments, and like make other people look small and stupid. And that has a really problematic effect. It's known as in psychology as the blowback effect. So when you not only counter someone's belief, but also like make them feel small about it and like yell at them in a way that they feel insulted, they're more likely to dig their heels in and hold on to that belief more. And so I encounter people all the time who have a very anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel framework that's been given to them. These are all good people who in general have just been given this really bad narrative as fact by people that they trust. You know, it's not their own research. It's just like the story that's been handed to them as truth. And so they believe these things, and some of them are if spoken to in a way where their best side is assumed from a place of like honor and respect, some people are really open to hearing other perspectives. So the answer to your question is yes, I've lost friends, I've lost allies, I've lost my positions in organizations because of my background and my ethnicity and my nationality, and my being vocal about issues with Jews and Israel. But I've also found that there is growth and movement and a desire for people to integrate new information if it's given over to them in a way that they can hear it.
That's good to hear that there's still hope and still a way to make a change. The next question also comes from a student from Canada who said that on their campus, they're trying to tie in a BDS resolution to a motion also supporting the Indigenous community. And how do we combat BDS while still advocating for the Indigenous community when they tie the two causes together?
That's hard. In my experience, it's really important to be able to call out BDS for what it is, which is a colonialist, oppressive, bigoted, racist tool of genocide, all right? Depriving, flipping the narrative on its head, and actually shining like a little bit of the light of truth onto it. You know, there's, like I said, there's been this push to have Palestinians and Arabs in general identified as indigenous, and therefore partnered with their cause with all other indigenous causes. And in general, it preys on the good intentions of the indigenous activists and their lack of knowledge about the history of tiny tribal nations in the Middle East, which is understandable that that's not there. And people in general, I believe people want to do good. I've worked in human rights for a really long time, so I've seen that's not always the case. But as a person, I really function under the premise that people really are good ultimately and want to do good ultimately. And BDS is a colonialist tool of genocide against an indigenous peoples. So it's counterproductive and counterintuitive for other indigenous peoples to support that. How to combat that's a little bit more complicated, because really, 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 especially within tribal nations, the only way to create like real lasting awareness is through creating relationships, through getting to know each other. I had when was it? Just like a couple months ago, I went and dropped off a box of masks to a local tribal organization. And they posted it on their Instagram. And the first comment, they posted something like, "Thanks to Indigenous Bridges and the local Jewish community for this donation of PPE. We're really appreciative of it, and we look forward to working with you in the future." And the literal first comment on that post was, "Now tell them to free Palestine." And so my response was to invite to find out who that person was. And it turns out it was someone related to somebody that I know. And to invite them over for Shabbat, to really extend my hand in friendship and be like, okay, you get to know me, I get to know you. And then once we like establish a relationship, let's actually talk. And I'm not gonna like talk to you, I'm gonna learn with you. This sort of like Talmudic model, like we're going to talk about, like, you take out your phone, I want you to Google, like where this tribe is from, like the Balfour Declaration, the history of the Jewish people, and then figure out like who is and is not indigenous. But it's not something that you can just like put out a soundbite or like say like, no, this is crazy online and have it actually take effect. It's important that people speak up and like point these crazy narratives out for what they are. But the real work is done in relationship building. And so I don't know what I would do. I think I would probably go to the administration and voice my concerns. I would definitely go to the Native leaders and voice my concerns. And I would frame it as that this is a pan-Arab colonialist narrative that's main object is the continued genocide of a tiny indigenous minority. Is this something that you really want to support? And if you don't understand what I'm saying, like I like see you and I acknowledge you and I understand where you're coming from, like I'm happy to like sit and like, give you my emotional labor and time to like go over things with you if you're interested in, over coffee. Come to my house for Shabbat, come over for ice cream, like I'll take you out, and just to like create that relationship, because that's the way that things like that stop happening long term. Hope that helps.
I'm sure it helped. This was very interesting, and we have so many other questions, but we'll have to do another webinar because we have to end soon. So I'll just get to the last two questions. I'll put them together. also from two students. The first one is a more like, do you have any book recommendations or movie or whatever resources that you recommend for people that want to learn more about either Native American or indigeneity or everything you discussed tonight, I guess. And then to end this, how can students get involved either with your organization, or how can Jewish students help Native Americans in general? Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, so there's a lot out there. there's now a real push for the recognition of Native histories, and art, and Indigenous culture. I don't even know where I would start with that right now. We're teaming up right now with another organization. We've teamed up with a lot of different organizations over the last couple of years, but we're working with this other organization right now, which brings Indigenous art and culture to different communities. So the webinars, things like that, I'm happy to try and send in anybody's direction. We post a lot of stuff. We have a very small Facebook group and following, but if anybody's interested in following us on Facebook, if anybody still has Facebook, Indigenous Bridges is there, and we post a lot of information. And it's the people who post are they're from tribal nations all over. So it's a lot of like very like niche stuff from their own communities, and also like broader stuff. So there's a lot of information out there. And then we also cross post from a lot of other interesting groups on Facebook that focus on Indigenous education and things of that nature. So there's a lot of good resources on our Facebook page. Our web presence in general has been really like small, because of the nature of what we do and how much people hate Jews. I've tried to sort of like keep us as sort of quiet. That's ending now because we're growing and changing as an organization. But you feel free to add us on Facebook to like our page and follow us. And we post a lot. And what was the second part of the question?
The second part is like how can students get involved either with your organization or just help Native Americans in general?
So one of my big goals is to really do a lot of this liaison work, to create a lot of events for community partnerships, getting to know each other. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I am happy to help put together an event or events that bring the Jewish community and local tribal nations together. I have a lot of different connections in different places. And if I don't, one of my other team members do. We work with tribal leaders from nations all over North America, and also the activist community. I'm happy to come out or give talks on campus. Laura, myself, and Emily, and a couple other people are talking about putting together a panel that talks about Indigenous identity, intersectionalism, and Israel. And we do a lot of different things. So if there's an interest in having us come out or talk or present or help put together an event, especially if somebody is interested in actually doing a lot of the organization for that, I am so happy to make that happen or help assist in any way. There really is a desperate need for it. There is a huge need for partnership between our communities, and starting off in places like university where people, go to learn and experience new things and meet new people. This is like the perfect thing. So yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to try and help make that happen, or one of my partners is. And I'm excited that there's an interest.
No, there's actually a lot of interest. There are so many other questions, but Ateret, I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. This has been
My pleasure.
a fascinating conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us on
Thank you so much.
Facebook and everywhere else, and have a good night.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.